From Florence, Italy, the city of inspiration for sculptors in ages past and for centuries to come, you're listening to The Sculptor's Funeral.
Good day to you all, and welcome once again to another episode of The Sculptor's Funeral, the podcast for figurative sculpture. I am your host, Jason Arkles, a sculptor and educator living in Florence, Italy, where all the great sculptors are dead, and I don't feel so well myself, and today we are going to talk about the David. Yes, the David. We all know what I'm talking about. There are many Davids in the history of Renaissance art, but there is only one which can be identified as the David. One of the most recognizable works of art in the world, Michelangelo's monumental ideal nude, needs no introduction at all. But having said that, its ubiquitous presence in our culture means that an introduction to the David is as far as many of us get. But once we move past the mere recognition of the David and its author, lots of questions arise. Why was it created? What does it truly represent? Why is the head so big? Why is he nude? And why is this statue, above all others, the most famous in the world? Is it because it's the most beautiful? Is it because it's the biggest? What makes this David the David? Well, I'm going to try to answer all these questions and more today, focusing the entire episode on this one single sculpture. As with much of Michelangelo's work and life, there are a lot of inaccuracies and mythologies circulating about the David, about its creation, about its proper place in the history of art. The legends and assumptions surrounding this statue could use a bit of a reality check. And at the end of the day, we'll find that even when stripped of its mythologies, the David still stands as a remarkable masterpiece, but perhaps for reasons not often considered by the throngs of tourists clogging up the piazzas and museums of Florence today. To properly understand the context of the David and why it was commissioned in the first place, we need to go all the way back to the beginnings of Renaissance Florence, as the idea for the David was born over a century before Michelangelo was born. A sculpture of David, the Old Testament king of the nation of Israel, was just one part of a very grandiose decorative scheme for the exterior of Florence's cathedral, known as the Duomo. The Duomo was originally designed at the end of the 13th century by Arnolfo di Cambio, and later enlarged upon by subsequent architects. And at some point, and I couldn't actually pinpoint exactly when, the design for the decoration of the exterior of the Duomo called for the placement of 12 statues, each depicting a king or prophet of Israel, to be placed upon each of the 12 buttresses supporting the dome of the cathedral. Now, this might have been part of Arnolfo di Cambio's original plan, as decorating the top of a buttress with a statue like this is a convention common to late Gothic architecture, but over the course of the 140 years it took to complete the cathedral, the original plan of the Duomo lost some of its Gothic elements as other architects took over and sort of updated the design. And of course, one of the elements it lost was this scheme of placing statues on the buttresses. There are no statues on the buttresses of the Duomo today, right? But not for lack of trying. In 1408, we see that Donatello was commissioned for a life-size statue of David in marble, not to be confused with his more famous bronze David. And this marble David was right at the beginning of Donatello's career. Now, at the same time, Donatello's friend and peer, Nanni Debanco, was commissioned for a statue of the prophet Isaiah. Nanni's Isaiah can be found today in a niche on the inside of the Duomo, and the marble David by Donatello can be seen in the Bargello Museum in Florence, and I've actually mentioned it in previous podcasts. But both of these statues were originally meant for the buttresses of the Duomo. However, when one of these statues was hoisted up and placed onto a buttress, it was obvious to all down below on the ground that the life-sized scale of the statue was completely inadequate for the enormous scale of the Duomo and for the tremendous height at which the statues were to be placed. So Donatello and Nanni's statues were never permanently placed on the Duomo's exterior. But the decorative scheme wasn't scrapped at that point. On the contrary, the scheme was enlarged, calling for colossal statues to be placed upon the buttresses. Now keep in mind, this is 1408, 1410, early on in the Renaissance, before anyone had created any sort of colossal statuary to be displayed anywhere, much less 100 feet up in the air. And this was also a few decades before Filippo Brunelleschi designed and built the cupola of the Duomo and all the technical advances that he instigated in doing so. So there were some major technical issues that needed to be solved in order that this scheme of colossal statuary was to come about. And around 1410, Donatello had another crack at placing a statue on top of the Duomo in the character of Joshua. Now, this statue of Joshua was about 3 times life-size and made of bricks or fired terracotta of some sort, and then covered over with a layer of white stucco, which gave it the look of a marble statue when seen from the ground. Now, building the statue out of bricks and stucco had the advantage that the work could be created on the ground, disassembled, and then transported piece by piece up to the top of the buttress and reassembled and finished in situ, avoiding the necessity of lifting a colossal figure from the ground. Now, Donatello's colossal statue of Joshua was deemed a success, but unfortunately, it doesn't survive. It weathered badly and was removed in the 18th century, but until that time, until the 18th century, the statue of Joshua could be seen atop this buttress. And a few years after the Joshua was finished, in 1415, Donatello started work on another figure for the Duomo in partnership with Filippo Brunelleschi. This 1415 figure wasn't an Old Testament prophet at all, but rather a statue of Hercules, the pagan hero. Now, this might seem a bit strange to put a pagan figure on a church, but Hercules has a strong tradition in Italy of serving as a Christian symbol of virtue and strength. In the 13th century, for instance, Nicola Pisano had included a Hercules on his pulpit for the Pisa baptistry, and there was even a small figure of Hercules on the decorative north door of the Florence Duomo already. One of the ways that sculptors and architects got away with the inclusion of the pagan hero Hercules was to give Hercules a biblical double, right? For instance, Nicola Pisano's Hercules was also called Daniel. And it's interesting, we also find that throughout the Middle Ages, in manuscript illuminations and frescoes, the character of Hercules is often paired with King David as well, sometimes going so far as to represent King David wielding a club, just like Hercules did. Now, the statue of Hercules, begun by Donatello and Brunelleschi, never got beyond the model stage, but it's worth noting the experimental technique they used to create this large figure. They built the figure from a core of stone, just, blocks cemented together, but then this stone core was to be clad in gilt bronze sections, right? So the bronze figure would be composed of many small pieces cast separately and joined together over this stone core. Now, even though this Hercules was never finished, Donatello would later use this technique of assembly for a bronze sculpture he made known as the St. Louis of Toulouse, which was meant for the Church of Or San Michele and is now in the Church of Santa Croce. So at this point, we have just one statue made of bricks and stucco up on the Duomo and another unfinished model on the ground. And things stayed that way for several decades, until once again Donatello, now in his old age, returns to Florence after an extended period of working in Padua and Siena, and he's given a commission for another statue for the buttresses of the Duomo, and this time in partnership with a former pupil of his, Agostino di Duccio. Now, precise records are scarce, but scholars generally agree that the statue was to be Donatello's design, but executed by Duccio under Donatello's supervision, right? And the subject of this figure was to be a David. If completed, this would be no less than the third David in Donatello's inventory. I talked a little bit about why the subject of David was so popular in Renaissance Florence. I did that in episode number 43, titled Donatello Among the Medici. I'll bring it up again later in this episode, but I'll just reiterate here that the figure of David was closely connected to the identity of the Florentine Republic, and this meant his inclusion in the collection of characters up on top of the buttresses of the Duomo was not only mandatory, but the David would be one of the most significant and prominent figures of that group. Little wonder that the wool guild, the Arte della Lana, who was responsible for this particular project, would be anxious that the great Donatello himself at least design and oversee the creation of the David. And this new addition to the Duomo would not be made of brick or stucco like Donatello's Joshua 40 years before. No, instead this work would be carved from a single block of marble. Work seems to have begun in 1464, after a lengthy process of selecting an enormous block of Carrara marble and transporting it from atop a mountain down to the sea, then up the Arno River, and finally into the enclosed courtyard of the cathedral workshop, known as the Opera del Duomo. Now, work on this statue, this marble David, progressed for 2 years, but came to a halt with the death of Donatello in 1466. Now, either Agostino di Duccio or the Arte della Lana felt that Duccio could not continue without his master's guidance. Now, what this meant in practical terms was that there was, lying in the courtyard of the cathedral workshop, a huge, unfinished sculpture. It had been carved with the figure lying on its back rather than upright. Now, this made working on an enormous figure like this in its early stages a bit easier and safer, right? So Duccio probably spent those 2 years of work taking away all the extraneous chunks of marble, right, the corners and that sort of thing, in an effort to remove as much weight as possible before the marble would then be stood up on its feet and finished. Now, sources indicate that Duccio had gone so far as to start to give shape to the pose in the legs, including the negative space in between the legs, as well as the upper torso and even a little bit of drapery as well. In any event, the work was far enough along that the marble was not referred to as a block, but as a statue in the Opera del Duomo's records. It even garnered the nickname of Il Gigante, the Giant, which is, of course, slightly ironic, considering it was intended as a statue of David, the giant killer. Now, this unfinished statue lay on the ground for the next 35 years, taking up valuable space in the workshop's courtyard and weathering in the open air. But as the year 1500 approached, the Arte della Lana decided that now was the time to reevaluate this Gigante, stand it up on its feet, and have a good look at it, and determine whether it should be broken up into smaller, more usable pieces of marble, or finished by a contemporary sculptor. And this, finally, is where Michelangelo Buonarroti steps in. Several artists were considered to take up this half-carved, weathered colossus, but it was the young Michelangelo, freshly returned from Rome, where he completed his first and most amazing Pietà, who was awarded the commission. And there were good reasons this promising 25-year-old sculptor should receive this commission. He was the only one in Florence with relevant experience. You see, 8 years previous to 1500, when the young Michelangelo was still in Florence and working at the pleasure of the Medici court, he was commissioned to carve a larger-than-life-sized figure, only about 7.5 feet high, or 233 centimeters, of a Hercules. And he carved it out of a block of marble that had sat in the Medici garden for a few decades, which, like the Gigante, was considered badly weathered. So he had experience working over life size in marble and also working weathered blocks. Now, if you had never known that a statue of Hercules by Michelangelo existed, well, you can be forgiven, because it no longer exists, at least not to anyone's knowledge. In the 16th century, it was sold off to the gardens of Fontainebleau, France, where it disappeared in the 18th century amid the destruction and turmoil of the French Revolution. Michelangelo had come back to Florence from Rome in the spring of 1501, intending to complete a commission for a dozen small statues for a chapel in Siena, but his return coincided happily with the Wool Guild's decision to do something with the Gigante, and with little deliberation and with no formal competition for this commission, Michelangelo was granted the job. He was to be given all the assistance and materials he required, as well as a monthly salary, and the commission called for the statue to be complete within 2 years. Now, a 2-year timetable might sound like a very short time for a young sculptor to take up the task of completing the first marble colossus since antiquity. But it must be remembered that the statue had already been worked on for 2 years. Not only was there a great quantity of stone already taken off, but the removal of that stone meant that Michelangelo was more or less locked into the pose that Donatello had presumably chosen for the David 35 years before. This is an important aspect of the David that is hardly ever talked about. Not only was the choice of subject, that of the David, not Michelangelo's idea, but the very pose of the figure was most likely dictated by the work that had been done before on the block. Michelangelo's David practically can be considered a collaboration between Donatello and Duccio and Michelangelo. And all the previous work done on the marble also meant that Michelangelo didn't have to spend too much time on developing a composition by himself or blasting off the large extraneous chunks that can take up such a large amount of time when working on this scale. So this head start, in addition to all the help he was getting from his assistants he employed, meant that within 9 months of beginning work, the statue was declared half-finished by the Wool Guild, and they rewarded Michelangelo accordingly. Now, just what was Michelangelo's working process on the David? Well, it's very difficult to say. We know he had assistants, and Vasari records that Michelangelo made a model and carved the marble based on that model. It's also recorded that he built scaffolding up all around the upright block, which would have been necessary in order to reach all parts of this 17-foot-tall block of marble. But he also apparently covered the scaffolds with cloth or something else, either with the express intention of concealing his statue from view, or, more probably, in order to keep flying chips of marble from hitting other artisans at work in the enclosed courtyard of the Opera del Duomo. Vasari, with his predilection for drama, says Michelangelo refused to let anyone see the work progress, but we know from other sources that, of course, the work would have been regularly inspected by members of the Wool Guild, and anyone working in the Opera del Duomo at the time would have had ample opportunity to see the work being carried out. I mean, a 17-foot-tall statue being carved in the middle of an active workshop is not something you can really keep a secret. And in fact, in the summer of 1503, about a year and a half into the work, the Wool Guild was so impressed by the statue's progress that they wanted to show it off to the general public, even though there was still 6 months' work left to go on it. So coinciding with the annual celebration of Florence's patron saint, John the Baptist, the Arte della Lana removed the scaffolding from in front of the unfinished David and allowed the public free entry to inspect Il Gigante in progress. So, work on the David started in the fall of 1501, and just a little over 2 years later, in January 1504, the work was almost done. At least it was sufficiently far enough along that some serious thought needed to take place to figure out what to do with this amazing, unprecedented statue. Now, the plan, of course, had originally been to place it atop the buttress of the Duomo, but since 1501, there seems to have been a growing recognition that this statue was far too significant to be put so far out of reach. There are some who say that an alternate location was chosen because they couldn't figure out how to get the David on top of the buttress, but of course they knew how. It would have been difficult and expensive, but certainly possible by 1504. This was Renaissance Florence, after all. Where there was a will, there was a way, but the will of Florence had other plans. A very remarkable document survives from this time. On the 25th of January, 1504, a meeting of artists and interested parties was organized by the Wool Guild, the Arte della Lana, and this meeting was convened with the express purpose of trying to figure out where the David should be placed. The document surviving from this meeting is no less than the highly detailed and official minutes of that meeting, and these minutes not only record who was there, but what each person said pertaining to the David. But the document says so much more. In reading these minutes, we can really get the sense of the significance of the David in the minds of the artists and political powers of Florence. We get a sense of what sort of power, what presence the David had as a work of art, as a political symbol, as a triumph and a milestone in the resurrection of the glory of ancient Roman culture that was and is the Renaissance. Now we'll delve into this precious document and see what it reveals about the David and about the Republic for which it stands when the sculptor's funeral continues. Hey everybody, it's good to be back after the holiday season. I'm looking forward to the new year, and I hope it's a good one for me and for you. January is a great time to get your plans in order for the rest of the year, and I'm doing just that. In addition to my regular teaching and the workshops that I offer in Florence, I'm putting together my travel workshop schedule as well. Regular listeners to the podcast already know about the marble carving course I gave last summer in the UK, and I'll be offering that course again this August. I'll also be back at Mapstone Studios in Devon, England, in July with a brand new course in clay sketching and sculpture composition, which you'll be hearing about more in the coming months. I'm very excited about that. But with summer still many months away, I wanted to reach out to my listeners around the world who might be planning their year for their own studios and sculpture departments. If you are interested in drawing in new students, offering a more diverse range of workshops, and making a little money in the process, perhaps you'd like to consider hosting one of my workshops this year. I teach traveling workshops in figure and portrait modeling, both using the sight-size method. I teach anatomy and écorché, composition and clay sketching, and even stone and marble carving. And of course, I can talk my head off about art history, so if you're interested in my presenting a lecture or lecture series as well, I got that covered. And as you already know, I talk about the workshops I give on my podcast, which is a great advertising opportunity for your studio and at no cost to you, and a chance to draw in students from all over the world. So if you're interested in collaborating on a workshop with me, Jason Arkles, the host of the Sculptor's Funeral podcast, get in touch and we'll start talking. Email me at thesculptorsfuneral@gmail.com or jason@jasonarkles.com. Have me over for a workshop and increase your studio's visibility, make some money, and learn something new. So at least 30 people attended this wonderful little meeting on the 25th of January, 1504, to decide just where to put Michelangelo's David. And the list of attendees includes Leonardo da Vinci, Sandro Botticelli, Luca della Robbia's son, Andrea, Domenico Ghirlandaio's brother, Davide, Filippo Lippi, Jacopo Sansovino, Paolo Aiuolo, Lorenzo di Credi, Granacci, Antonio and Giuliano di San Gallo, just to name some of the more prominent artists in attendance. Now, this list tells us just how important this was, not just because who was invited, but because all these illustrious artists, some of whom had harbored professional jealousies towards Michelangelo, all made sure to attend the meeting. 9 different sites for the statue were considered, not just the buttresses of the Duomo, but also out in front of the Duomo, in the piazza, as well as in the Loggia de Lanzi, in the Piazza Signoria, and even the interior courtyard of the Palazzo Signoria. Talk quickly boiled down to just 2 choices, either the Loggia or out in front of the town hall, the Palazzo Signoria. Now, the location of the loggia is just off the corner of the town hall in that same piazza. And what a loggia is, it's a sort of a covered porch or portico, where today we find the statuary of Benvenuto Cellini, Gian Bologna, and several others. But back then, in 1504, it was mostly used as a ceremonial platform for the celebrations, speeches, and spectacles of the Florentine Republic. That the choice of placement came down to either the front of the town hall or just off the town hall in the most prominent square of Florence is actually quite remarkable. Remember that the David was originally intended as a decoration for the cathedral. It's a biblical figure, and it was supposed to go in a sacred setting. This was meant to be art for a church. The people paying for the creation of the David, however, the Wool Guild, the wealthiest and most politically influential guild in Florence, evidently decided that the power of the David should be wielded for the political good of Florence rather than the spiritual good. It was only a few years prior to this meeting that Florence had been virtually terrorized by the religious extremist monk Savonarola, whose attempts to transform the Republic of Florence into a fundamentalist theocracy had ended with Savonarola burning at the stake. The placement of the colossal David, with its fierce gaze and implied violence, must have seemed too unpalatably powerful to be connected with the Duomo, the seat of religious power in Florence. Presumably it was decided that the force and vigor of the David should be used for political rather than religious intentions. But even with the question of sacred versus secular out of the way, the remaining different choices presented for the placement of the David within themselves contained differing partisan bias. Now, placing the David in front of the town hall with David's scowling face turned south towards Rome, was a blatant statement of defiance towards the enemies of Florence. And that list of enemies included the giants of the Holy See, the succession of popes who sought the land and wealth of northern Italy. It included the foreign powers of France, Spain, and Austria, as well as the exiled Medici family, now in the incompetent and greedy hands of Lorenzo the Magnificent's son, Piero. Placing the David in front of the Palazzo Signoria would mean displacing Donatello's statue of Judith and Holofernes, a statue bought and paid for by the Medici family, and a work synonymous with Medician power in Florence. Replacing the Judith with the David would be an overt statement of defiance of the Medici, coming from the anti-Medician government headed by Piero Soderini. On the other hand, placing the David in the loggia would mean that the statue would face east and at a blank wall, effectively negating the power of David's fierce expression. And this placement was suited to the members of the committee who were pro-Medici, or otherwise opposed to the Republican rule of Florence, or merely sympathetic to the various causes of the power of Rome or other rival political forces. Leonardo da Vinci was one of those who favored the placement in the loggia, possibly because that placement lessened the general impact of his rival's work of art. But rather than speak up against the Republic of Florence directly, in justifying the placement in the loggia, the main argument on that side was that the loggia would shelter and protect the marble, which was considered soft and flawed. Another argument raised was that under the loggia, the David could be more closely guarded against vandalism. The implication here, of course, was that if the David were used overtly as an anti-Medician symbol by placing it in front of the town hall, pro-Medician forces might take their retribution upon it. By mitigating the power of the statue, by putting it facing a wall in a loggia, one mitigates the partisan bias the statue would otherwise signify. The David in the loggia would be an act of political compromise. At the end of the day, the decision as to where the statue should go was always in the hands of the government, the Signoria, headed by anti-Medician partisans. And everyone at the meeting seems to have understood this. When you read the minutes, most arguments against the opinions of the Signoria come couched in very sort of soft language, or are just non-committal or deferential. And as we all know, the David did indeed end up displacing the Judith and Holofernes by Donatello to stand outside the main portal of the Signoria. A few months after this meeting, the statue of David was slowly and carefully moved from its birthplace at the Opera del Duomo, taking 4 days to travel the half-mile to the town hall. On the first night it spent on its journey to Piazza Signoria, a small gang, possibly Medici supporters, threw rocks at the statue until they were chased away. When the statue finally arrived at its destination, a few finishing touches were added that do not actually survive today. Gilding, in fact, was added to the tree trunk, which stands behind David's weight-bearing leg, as well as his sling that was also gilded, and a decorative and modest garland was placed to conceal David's manhood, and a gilt laurel wreath crowned David's head. Whatever the political intention of the government of Florence was at the time, the statue of David very quickly came to represent the spirit of the independence of the Florentines themselves, and their willingness to defend the city and all it held dear. And just as the David embodied the spirit of the Florentines for the Florentines, the David also embodies the spirit of Renaissance Florence for the rest of the world, from that time 500 years ago, right up until today. The David is the mascot of the Renaissance, its logo. Its very image has served as cultural shorthand for genius, taste, culture, and beauty for the last 500 years. And it's in this sense that we can say that it is probably the most perfect piece of public art ever created, encapsulating the zeitgeist of a time and place more completely than any other piece of art I can think of. And of course, this is where the David gets into a little bit of trouble these days. The problem is that it's been so highly regarded for so long that the David today, more than anything else, is famous for being famous. Everyone knows the David. Many fewer people know that the David is a biblical character, or that the statue represents the independence of the Florentine Republic. And because of the longevity of its fame and its service as a synonym for genius and beauty, the David today suffers from a big misconception. People commonly assume the David is preeminently famous, not because it is synonymous with the glories of the Renaissance, but that it itself is the glory of the Renaissance, that the David is the most beautiful and perfect statue in the world. Now, are those people correct? Is the David the most beautiful, most perfect statue in the world? That's actually a really hard question, and I'm not going to say it's not. Now, whether the power of the David comes from its fierce gaze, or from its political implications, or if that power derives from its global celebrity, it does wield great power and influence in our culture, more than most other works of art. But this power is something with which we, as a culture, imbue it, just as the viewer of any object transforms that object into a work of art by the significance the viewer attaches to it. An object becomes art when we regard it as such, and thinking makes it so. So yes, the David is one of the greatest works of art in history, just as Leonardo's Mona Lisa is, but primarily because our culture says it is, above and beyond whatever merit, attributes, and intentions the work of art itself had at its creation. Now, having said that, we can and should examine the David critically in order to understand it on its own merits as a sculpture and to better understand Michelangelo himself. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Michelangelo's David, which is approximately 0 of you, you can go to the website, thesculptorsfuneral.com, and click on the image gallery link for this episode, episode number 48. And I suppose if you look really hard, you might find a picture or two of the David on the internet. So, the first thing we recognize in the David is that it is the first colossus in a single block of marble carved since ancient Rome, and that it is the first freestanding, ideal nude since that time as well. It is truly a milestone in the development of the Renaissance, the regaining of ancient culture, or at least the regaining of the attributes of ancient culture. Now, we've seen nude statuary in Florentine sculpture before, of course. There's Donatello's David, who's nude except for a hat and some shin guards, which is still pretty nude. And of course, there's a bunch of naked little baby Jesuses around by 1504 as well. But these works are naturalistic rather than ideal, rendering the human form not based upon any notions of physical perfection, but the human form in its reality. Now, there do also exist several small ideal nudes, going all the way back to Niccolo Pisano's Hercules/Daniel, which I mentioned earlier. But there's a difference between what Michelangelo has done with his David and what his idealizing predecessors had done. Niccolo Pisano, for instance, made his Hercules an ideal nude because he was copying from the antique. His primary source was an idealized nude from a Roman sarcophagus, and so his work copied those forms. And in doing so, Pisano effectively captures the effects of idealization. But Michelangelo doesn't just copy the effects of idealization, he begins with the causes of idealization. And the cause of the idealization is philosophy. Philosophy, combined with the study of the human figure in its reality, drives the idealization of the David. We must remember that Michelangelo's training in his youth was not merely technical, but literary and philosophical. Living in the household of Lorenzo de' Medici, Michelangelo was tutored by the various members of Lorenzo's Platonic Academy, a sort of supper club organized by Lorenzo's grandfather, Cosimo de' Medici, and it was a regular gathering of the brightest intellects and men of rare educations, dedicated to the rediscovery of ancient literature, poetry, philosophy, and culture. Poliziano himself, the scholar and philosopher who translated Homer's Iliad from Greek into Latin, had suggested themes and courses of study to Michelangelo in his teenage years, including the theme for his early relief of the Battle of the Centaurs. And one of the strongest and most lasting influences on Michelangelo came from his exposure to the philosophy of Platonism and Neoplatonic thought. Neoplatonism was an attempt by early Christian scholars to merge Christian theology with Platonic philosophy. There's a good deal of overlap between the two in terms of worldview, and early Christian scholars thought the adaptation of pagan philosophy to Christianity would assist in spreading the faith. Neoplatonism was taken up again by the Platonic Academy, at least in part, as a means of justifying pursuit of pagan thought and teaching to those less tolerant of influences outside the scope of the Church of Rome. I could do an entire podcast on Neoplatonism and its influences in art, and maybe someday I will, but for now, I just need to highlight a few ideas that shed light on the idealization inherent in the David. One of the core principles of Neoplatonism is the concept of the One, and you can think of the One as synonymous with the Christian God. The entire cosmos emanates from the One. However, the One, being perfect, is not perceptible to imperfect beings like you and me. Likewise, the world itself and everything in it is but a shadowy image of a more perfect world which exists outside the realm of the senses. So in a nutshell, people and things that we know are just imperfect reflections of a more perfect state. Our physical bodies are reflections of our perfect souls, but these reflections are corrupted by the material world. And this is where the significance of idealization arises. Idealization in the arts is not an attempt to make the most perfect, beautiful bodies just because they're the nicest to look at. The reason ideal forms are nice to look at is because they are the closest we can get to the perfection of the immortal soul in our life. Beauty exists to lead us towards spiritual perfection, according to the Neoplatonists. Beauty and perfection are a means of getting closer to a higher truth, a means of getting closer to God, to the One. It sounds pretty esoteric, and I suppose it is, but this line of thinking wasn't just limited to a few philosophers sitting around the Medici table. The idea that the nature of physical form reveals the nature of the soul was a common one in Renaissance Florence. This way of looking at the world had been around since the ancients, in fact, and was elevated to a pseudoscience called physiognomy. The word physiognomy is Greek, and it means judge of nature. And physiognomy was the study of the human features to determine the character of an individual. How a person looks reveals their character. Facial features could indicate personality traits. So someone with a heavy, furrowed brow was prone to anger. Brave people had straight backs. Ugly people, well, they must have had some sort of inner defect like envy or greed that makes them ugly, just as beautiful people must be virtuous and kind. So when we look at the ideal nude figure of the David, we need to understand that its idealization was not an attempt on Michelangelo's part to make the most beautiful or perfect form for the sake of beauty or perfection. The ideal form of the David is a direct allusion to the greatness of David's soul. And this is the starting point for all idealization that would come to art in Europe for the next several centuries. Bernini would have his own sense of the ideal, one which would influence artists for 2 centuries after him. The neoclassicists, they would turn back to the Greeks for their own sense of the ideal. And yes, the goal was beauty, but beauty itself had a purpose, and that was to express the perfections which exist in the immaterial world. The impact and influence of the idealization of the David, displayed in the main public square and in colossal form, cast its shadow over the artists of Florence for the entirety of the 16th century. Well, all that sounds very noble and good, but wait, you say. If the David is so ideal, what's up with the big head? Why are his hands so big? The disproportionate head and hands of the David, that's one of the most commented upon elements of the statue, and it's given rise to a lot of theories over the years. There are some historians who claim that it was intentional, and that the enlarged head and hands were done for symbolic emphasis. Others say that he did it so that the head and hands would be seen more clearly from a distance, as the original intention was, of course, to place the figure way up high. I think most people discredit both of these ideas these days. Enlarging the head and hands for the purpose of symbolism doesn't really make much sense. And in fact, no one writing at the time, including the biographers of Michelangelo, it should be noted, never commented on the disproportion in any way. And as for making the head and hands bigger to increase visibility, well, that just seems silly. I mean, the head and hands are just a little bit bigger than they should be, and adding a few inches to the proportions would really make no difference in their legibility from the distance of over 100 feet away. If a head 3 times life size isn't going to be seen clearly from up on top of a buttress of the Duomo, then 3.2 times life size isn't going to cut it either. And then there's the most popular theory justifying the big head and hands, the theory that it was done for the sake of optical correction. That Michelangelo knew that when seen from below, the head of his David would look a little small, and so he made it bigger in order that it would look correct from street level. And this theory is also incorrect. Or at least, if this is indeed what Michelangelo intended, then he really goofed up, because optical correction just doesn't work that way. Optical correction had been practiced by sculptors for centuries before Michelangelo, but the practice never involved enlarging individual features, like a head or a hand. Optical correction involves lengthening and shortening limbs, not inflating or shrinking them. When seen from below, parts of the body are foreshortened, and so to correct this, the torso and arms are lengthened, as in Donatello's St. Mark, or the thighs of a seated figure are shortened, like in Michelangelo's own Moses. So if Michelangelo enlarged the head for the sake of optical correction, he was using an approach to optical correction that had never been done before or since, and in a way that was patently unsuccessful, seeing as how everyone who sees the David can't stop talking about the big head. If the optical correction had been successful, few people would ever notice, just as with the short thighs of the Moses. When optical correction works, no one notices. But wait, you say, everyone notices the big head because the statue is not displayed as originally intended. We'll never know how the David was really supposed to look high up on the north buttress of the Duomo. Well, actually, in 2010, a resin copy of the David was hoisted into place, temporarily, atop the buttress on the north side of the Duomo. So we know exactly how the David was originally going to look. And I've got some photos of it in situ at the image gallery. Now, some images show a fairly shallow angle taken from a distance, while others show a view of the David from a closer, steeper angle. And here's the thing. The closer you get, and the steeper the angle, the more obvious the disproportionate head and hands are. And the reason for this, of course, should be obvious. The head will always look too large, because you always see the head relative to the torso on which it sits. A too large head on a too small torso is too large in comparison to the torso at any distance. And when seen from below, the foreshortening of the torso only exacerbates the discrepancy. But don't take my word for it, check it out for yourself, and I think you'll agree that in the pictures with the David up on top of the Duomo, the closer you get to the statue, the bigger the head looks. So then, what is the reason the head and hands are so big? Well, now we come to the least popular theory of them all, the theory that Michelangelo did the best he could, but just got the proportions a little wrong. This very unpopular theory is all the more interesting by the fact it seems to be backed up with the largest amount of anecdotal evidence of all these theories. For starters, we know that the David was begun by another artist. We don't know how far Duccio got in the 2 years he worked the block in the 1460s, but it could be that certain aspects of the proportions were already set in stone before Michelangelo ever started. And then there's the problem of the location that the statue was carved, in the courtyard of the Opera del Duomo. Working in the enclosed courtyard would have limited the distance Michelangelo could have stood back from his work in order to judge proportions. Now, Leonardo da Vinci gives us the rule of thumb that in order to perceive an object's true dimensions and true proportions, you need to step back at a distance equal to 3 times the greatest dimension of the object. So for a 17-foot tall statue, that means Michelangelo would have needed to stand back about 50 feet in order to correctly judge proportions. And even assuming that that visual distance was available to him within this enclosed courtyard, we can't forget that the work was surrounded not only by scaffolding, but by some sort of visual barrier, either for privacy or for safety. These obstructions are well documented, and the removal of the visual barriers for a public viewing, late into the creation of the statue, was remarkable enough to record, so it probably didn't happen all that often. But regardless of whether or not Michelangelo could step back to see the proportions correctly, he didn't just eyeball the David, of course. It is recorded that he carved from a small model, as was common practice. He enlarged the measurements of a small model to produce his Colossus. But there's a problem with enlarging from models. If you measure your model precisely, the measurements capture everything, including your imperfections and your mistakes. So for instance, if you make a measurement error of a centimeter off of your half-life-sized model, that means that that centimeter of error becomes 6 centimeters when enlarged to a 3 times life-size figure, right? Now, could Michelangelo have made such a glaring mistake in his measurements? Maybe not. But could one of his anonymous assistants have done so? Perhaps. At the end of the day, we'll never really know why the head and hands are out of proportion. Not that it matters at all at this point. And in a certain sense, the mystery of the large head and hands is actually one of the aspects of the David that keeps this work continually in our consciousness. It keeps us talking about it and thinking about it. Like a reluctance to finish the last chapter of a favorite book, we savor the unsolved mysteries inherent in our favorite sculptures. The riddle of the David's big head is left to be solved only in our imaginations. And it's in our imaginations as well that Michelangelo places the object of David's fierce glare, the giant Goliath. Unlike Donatello and Verrocchio, who in their statues provide us with the severed head of the giant, and thus an intrinsically complete narrative, we are left to imagine Michelangelo's Goliath in the near distance, sneering haughtily moments before meeting his fate. The David does what all great sculpture does. It leaves a little bit of the work up to our imaginations to complete, thereby drawing the viewer into the act of creation itself. In the 19th century, it was decided that the David finally should be protected from the elements and moved indoors, so that it may be preserved for future generations. So the Accademia di Firenze had a new wing built onto its campus specifically to house the David. And thus the David retired from its job as an outstanding piece of public art and civic emblem, and took on a new role as object of fetish and worship, on full display at the center of its own temple. And for all my attempts to demythologize the David and its creator, it must be said that the David, now standing in its tribuna, might be the most gloriously displayed work of sculpture on earth, a vision that is spellbinding every time I encounter it. Well, I want to thank you all for listening. Don't forget, you can check out additional content at the Sculptor's Funeral YouTube channel or on our Facebook group page as well. And while you're there on the Facebook group page, you can join in the conversation. You can ask a question, leave a comment about the podcast, or about sculpture in general, or post current events, and much more. You can also subscribe to the podcast at Stitcher Mobile, or on iTunes, or subscribe really from any service from which you get your podcasts. And that way you can receive the podcast automatically on your PC, tablet, or mobile device. Check out the sculptorsfuneral.com website, where you can stream the complete archives of the show without having to subscribe to anything. You can check out the image galleries for this and for every episode. And you can also click the link for the sponsor of the podcast, Blick Art Supplies. Clicking on that link and buying from Blick supports the podcast, and for that, I thank you. Thanks again for listening, and have a productive week.